Welcome to Newsday on the BBC. I'm Sharonjit Lail. In Singapore, the headlines. President Trump meets with military advisors. He says major decisions would be taken within 48 hours on what action to take after the suspected Syrian chemical attack. The FBI raids the offices of President Trump's personal lawyer. Mr. Trump calls it a disgrace and a total witch hunt.
I'm Lebu Diseko in London. Also in the programme, in the coming hours, China's President Xi Jinping is expected to address the issue of a potential trade war with the US. And as snowfall increases in Antarctica, we examine what it means for global warming.
Live from our studios in Singapore and London. This is BBC World News. It's Newsday.
Well, good morning. It's 8 a.m. here in Singapore, 1 a.m. in London and 8 p.m. in New York, where the U.S. envoy to the United Nations has warned that America will respond to the suspected chemical weapons attack in Syria, regardless of whether the Security Council acts or not. Now, Syria has denied any involvement in the attack in which dozens of people are reported to have died. Here's our Middle East editor, Jeremy Bowen, a warning, though, that his report contains some images you may find distressing.
Most of the casualties in Syria's war were attacked with bullets and high explosive. But chemical weapons have a special horror. This is the aftermath of what witnesses said was a chemical attack as Douma, a town just outside Damascus, fell to the regime. We're not showing you pictures we have of dozens of dead bodies with foam on their mouths, which can be a sign of a chemical attack. All this is not evidence of the use of chemical weapons by the regime, say the Russians. President Trump doesn't believe them.
We'll be making some major decisions over the next 24 to 48 hours. If it's Russia, if it's Syria, if it's Iran, if it's all of them together, we'll figure it out, and we'll know the answers quite soon.
In 7 years of fighting, Syria's war has changed from a campaign to overthrow the regime to a mini-world war that's being fought by many of the world's most powerful countries and looks to be escalating. At the UN in New York, stark divisions over Syria and weapons of mass destruction, WMDs, are expanding into an even more serious international crisis.
Russia is being unpardonably threatened. The tone of the way this is being done has gone beyond the threshold of what is acceptable, even during the Cold War.
The Russian ambassador referred to a resurgence of the Cold War. This is not the Cold War, Mr. President. In the Cold War, there was not this flagrant disregard for the prohibitions that are universal on the use of WMD.
A year ago, the Americans retaliated after another chemical attack on Syrian civilians. It was mostly symbolic. The Assad regime, with Russian and Iranian help, has continued to strengthen its position. From the start of the war, the US, Britain and their allies called for President Assad to go. But they didn't back their words with deeds. When the president was vulnerable, the US and the UK chose not to act. Now he has the firm backing of Iran's supreme leader, Ayatollah Khamenei, and of course, Russia's President Putin. That makes him stronger now than at any time since the war began in 2011. It's hard to see what the West can do to change that. The Americans and the British missed their chance. In the last 48 hours, Syria's mini-world war has been heating up. This is said to be an Israeli jet crossing Lebanon to raid Syria. In February, the Israelis had a plane shot down as it hit the same target, an airbase called T4. Hitting T4 was not about chemical weapons, but Israel's fight with Iran. Supporters of President Assad took to the streets in Aleppo. the city in which the coalition between the Syrian regime, the Russians, and the Iranians scored their first significant victory. They still look to be the war's big winners, and it's hard to see how Western retaliation for the latest chemical attack is going to change that. Jeremy Bowen, BBC News.
All right, let's get more on what's been happening at the United Nations in the past few hours. A little bit earlier, I spoke to our correspondent, Neda Tawfik, who's at the UN in New York, and I asked her what the US hoped to achieve from all of this.
Well, you know, when you speak to UN experts, they say that the US, France, and the UK are going through the proper international channels, trying to say that once more they've gone through the United Nations Security Council just to tick the box before they ultimately take their own action to make sure that President Assad is punished for using chemical weapons in the past and, as they believe, possibly using chemical weapons in this case in Douma. Now, Security Council members are in the middle of negotiations, consultations as we speak over a draft U.S. resolution which aims to set up an impartial panel to investigate these cases of chemical weapons use in Syria. Now, Russia has said that the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons fact-finding mission can come to Douma tomorrow, that they and the Syrian government will ensure their safety on the ground to investigate. But the key issue is accountability. This is something that the Council had in the past. They had a mechanism to punish those who the panel found responsible, but Russia twice vetoed basically a resolution to extend that panel and has so far also refused to sanction the Syrian regime for those cases in which they were found responsible for using chemical weapons. So all of this means is that the Security Council remains deadlocked, and in fact we've seen through this Security Council meeting that tensions between the West and Russia are as tense as they've ever been. We heard the Russian ambassador there saying it's been worse, it's worse than the Cold War even. And so certainly here in the United Nations, officials have expressed concern about all of this just escalating and creating more issues in the relationship between Russia and the West.
And that was Neda Tawfik there at the UN. Now let's take a look at some of the day's other news now. And North Korea's Foreign Minister Ri Yong-ho has arrived in Moscow for high-level talks. He'll meet with his Russian counterpart Sergei Lavrov. Earlier, Donald Trump said his meeting with North Korean leader Kim Jong-un will be in May or in early June. And it's reported that Mr. Kim is willing to discuss ending his nuclear weapons program. And also making news today, at least 30 people, most of them children, have died after a school bus fell into a gorge in the northern Indian state of Himachal Pradesh. Most of the passengers were below the age of 10. The bus driver and 2 teachers were also killed in the accident. And the FBI has raided the office of President Trump's personal lawyer, Michael Cohen, and seized a variety of documents. It's understood some of the records involve his payment to the porn star Stormy Daniels, who claims to have had a brief affair with Mr. Trump. More details on that raid from David Willis.
What we know is that officials raided the office, home and apparently in a hotel in which Michael Cohen, President Trump's personal lawyer, had been staying in, and they recovered various documents, financial documents relating to some of his clients, including President Trump. They confiscated his mobile phone, it's been reported, and a computer. And they found amongst the documents, reports suggest, some relating to a 2016 payment to the adult film star Stormy Daniels, who has alleged that she had a sexual affair with Donald Trump several years ago. Mr. Trump, of course, denies this. Now, Michael Cohen's lawyer a short while ago said that the action on the part of the U.S. Attorney's Office in New York, they're the people who carried out this raid, was undertaken by way of a referral from the office of the special counsel Robert Mueller. The suggestion being that Robert Mueller and his team, who are looking into possible collusion between the Trump campaign and Russia in the run-up to the 2016 election, came across something that they thought constituted potential criminal action, and they forwarded that information to the local officials there. Now, President Trump as you mentioned, has said that this is a disgraceful situation, an attack on our country, as he put it, and asked by a reporter, will he now fire the special prosecutor, Robert Mueller? He said, many have said that I should fire him. We will see what happens.
David Willis there. Now, Facebook has started telling its users if they're among the 87 million people whose data was shared with the controversial firm Cambridge Analytica. It is one of the social media site's largest data breaches. Millions of users have been affected here in the UK, in the US, in the Philippines, Indonesia and also in Australia. Here's our media editor, Amal Rajan.
In less than a decade and a half, one company has done more than any other to connect the world, and not always in a good way. Each time we scroll, share or like something on Facebook, we leave a digital footprint. And our personal data can be scraped by developers of apps or applications, some of whom pass that information on to companies such as Cambridge Analytica. The British data firm's alleged use of such data has plunged Facebook into the biggest crisis in its history. Some 87 million users' data ended up in the firm's hands, 1 million of them British. This mathematician and entrepreneur gave evidence to MPs at the same time as a whistleblower who worked for Cambridge Analytica.
The Cambridge Analytica story shows that their policies and practices are not sufficient to handle our personal data properly. So I wouldn't trust Facebook, or Mark Zuckerberg for that matter, with our personal data. The personal data is an extension of ourselves. Do we really want to sell it? Just like we would sell an organ, maybe. So we have to be very careful there.
Today, Facebook pushed out 3 notifications to users. One was sent to all users, showing them how to remove apps they would rather didn't have access to their data. Another was sent to those who had downloaded This Is Your Digital Life. It was this app which an academic used to harvest information that was sent on to Cambridge Analytica. And a third notification was sent to the friends of those who had downloaded this app. Facebook used these messages to restate its effort to confront abuse. Not so long ago, most of us kept our most personal information in something like this, in hard copy. If you lost it, or if someone took it, then maybe one person would have access to that precious information. But now most of us leave such information online, and there such information can be scraped, shared or marketed to thousands of people. And once you lose control of it, it's very hard to get back. Facebook has spent much of the past 14 years apologising. As Chief Executive Mark Zuckerberg prepares to testify before US Congress this week, the recent changes to their privacy settings and today's notifications are a recognition that trust in their brand has been seriously damaged. Amal Rajan, BBC News.
Now, President Xi Jinping is expected to announce major economic reforms when he gives the keynote speech at the Boao Forum in Asia just very shortly. The annual gathering of government and business leaders is being held in the southern province of Hainan. And President Xi is also likely to address the issue of a potential trade war with the United States. Now, with me now to look at this potential trade war, which has been dominating a lot of the headlines, is David Edelman. He's the former U.S. ambassador to Singapore. Welcome to the program, Ambassador. Now, of course, the trade row is something that we've been focused on the last week or so. Billions of dollars of tariffs involved here. Now, while you were ambassador based here in Singapore, you had some insight into some of the decision makers, you know, who are making a lot of these decisions now in China and the US. What can you tell us about them, and where do you think this is headed?
Well, it's a great question, and all the world, I think, is watching to see where this is headed. As far as the dynamic between the two teams, this is happening at the very highest level. So we can expect on both the U.S. side, led by Ambassador Lighthizer, on the China side, led by Liu He. They're taking their cues from the very top, President Trump and President Xi in this case. My hope is that there's an interest on both sides of de-escalating this, taking some of the pressure out. And I think in a matter of an hour or two, we'll hear from President Xi, and that may very well give us a signal as to whether there's a mutual interest in trying to lighten up some of the rhetoric.
Indeed, he is expected to speak in the next hour or so. But I guess just going in a little bit more about the insight that you gleaned from having been based here a number of years. You led several trade missions in the region. Tell us what goes on behind closed doors at meetings like this when they are trying to de-escalate the situation, as you say.
Well, first, to orient you a little bit, President Obama was executing on his pivot to Asia. So the emphasis really was increasing trade, working to further engage all of the countries in Asia to improve the trans-Pacific trade and investment flows, for that matter. President Trump came into office, I suppose, with a very different sentiment. This America First campaign theme was decidedly protectionist. So what's going on in the rooms now around these issues may feel very different from what I experienced, which was coming out of the global financial crisis, a real interest in a deeper trade and investment engagement. That being said, what I know about what happens in these talks is they're probably constructive to the extent they're talking. I think there's probably a sense on both sides of the Pacific that ultimately a trade war, the looming trade war, is not in the interest of the global economy. These are two very much interdependent economies. They need each other. And I think decision makers in Beijing and Washington both know that.
All right, David Edelman, thank you so much for joining us and coming into the studio and speaking to us about that. Well, you're watching Newsday. Coming up on the program, scientists say it's now snowing much harder in Antarctica than it was 200 years ago, causing a slight slowing down effect in the rise of global sea levels.
Also on the program, thousands of noisy corellas, they're a type of white cockatoo, have been terrorizing residents in the South Australian capital of Adelaide.
Well, welcome back. You're watching Newsday on the BBC. I'm Sharon Lael in Singapore.
And I'm Lebu Tiseko in London. Our top stories. President Trump says a major decision is coming within 48 hours. That's after a suspected chemical attack on a rebel-held town in Syria.
And Facebook's founder Mark Zuckerberg has said a data breach on the network was due to his failure to appreciate how it could be used for harm. Well, let's take a look at some of the front pages from around the world now. If we take a look at Singapore's Straits Times, it claims the city-state's thirst for sweet drinks is fizzling out. Apparently, sales have slumped with health-conscious consumers, and that's led to soft drinks companies facing, or rather racing, to come up with the low-sugar options. Now, if you're growing tired of the cold weather over there in the West, well, guess what? The New York Times has a snap that might brighten up your day as a magnificent beach in East Timor, and the country is really hoping to use this natural beauty to attract tourists, but without destroying the marine life there. And the South China Morning Post features a local taxi. Oh my, wait till you take a look at this picture, because it found itself in a very precarious position. It ended up hanging over the entrance to a subway in Hong Kong. The driver had to be freed by firefighters, but thankfully he escaped with only minor injuries. Now, in other news, scientists say it's now snowing much harder in Antarctica than it was 200 years ago. Researchers compiled a record of snowfall by analyzing ice cores drilled from across the polar continent. Although the additional snowfall has reduced the sea level, correspondents say it's not enough to counteract ice losses at Antarctica's edges. Well, earlier I spoke to Brooke Medley from NASA.
So this was, yeah, as you said, it's been a lot of work from across many different agencies and many different countries. And the idea was we really wanted to understand how snowfall is changing over the Antarctic ice sheet because of, as you said, it impacts sea level. And so we were able to compile about 75 ice core records from all across Antarctica and put them together in sort of an intelligent way, so we can combine the ice core records, which give us the really long history, the 200-year history, as you already mentioned, but then we can combine it with climate models who give us a perfectly spatial picture of the snowfall changes.
Yeah, but it seems like all we ever seem to hear these days in the headlines and the news is global warming, how the ice is melting. So Did it surprise you that at the same time you're seeing increases in snowfall?
Actually, it's what we would expect. So in a warmer world, as the planet temperature gets warmer, that means the air can actually hold more moisture, and then we would expect then that moisture can travel to Antarctica and be deposited in the form of snow. So we actually anticipated to see this, but this is really the first time that we can say confidently from measurements, from observations, that we're actually starting to see this change.
NASA's Brooke Medley there. Now, this could be a scene straight out of a Hitchcock movie. Take a look at this. Thousands of noisy corellas, that's a type of white cockatoo, have been terrorising residents in the southern Australian capital of Adelaide, wreaking havoc to streetlights, signs and trees as they search for food. Now, the local council in the suburb of Playford tried everything from drones to pyrotechnics to move them on, but it's only managed to bring down their numbers by 2/3. All right, let's get more on this from Glenn Doherty. He's the mayor of Playford. Just tell us what has been happening.
Well, good morning. Look, it's been the flight of the birds here in the city of Playford. We've had thousands and thousands of white corellas attacking our community, and there's been lots and lots of damage. So we've seen flocks in their thousands. They land on street lights, they get into public furniture, into playgrounds, attack buildings, air conditioning systems, and it's just been causing havoc over the last 12 months here in the city of Playford.
So why has it been so hard to get rid of them?
We've done a number of things to disperse the flocks, to try to get them down into a couple of hundred at a time. So we've used drones to help get up there and disperse them, pyrotechnics and fireworks. We've also used a falconer. So we've actually had a gentleman come along with a falcon, which is a natural predator to the corellas, to help disperse those flocks so they don't settle and roost in our local community. And we also used some bird scaring devices, so making some loud noises and different distractions to help move them along so they don't create a new home. And as you can hear behind me, there's still plenty of birds around. I
mean, people must be pretty fed up. It must be quite hard to go about your business with that racket going on.
Look, it is, and it's the sight and sounds as you've seen from some of the clips and the footage. It's really hard to get outside in these warmer days and have a barbecue out the back or a kid's birthday party when all you see is thousands of corellas flocking over you. So that's why we've made sure we've been out there to try and disperse them, because it really is a sight to see, but it can inhibit your daily activities in the local community, and we don't want that for our local residents.
So what are you going to do now to try and really bring their numbers down?
Well, from our point of view, by dispersing them, we've been able to disperse them by 2/3. It's actually moving them out of our district and back to their natural habitats in northern parts of South Australia. So at the moment, they've been breeding really, really well because of abundant food and water sources in the peri-urban areas of Adelaide, which is where our council is. And as the weather starts to change here, they'll go back to their more natural habitat in the further drier parts of the state. So we'll continue to disperse them, but we're also working with the Australian and South Australian government around what are they going to do about the numbers of corellas, because they're now getting into really large numbers right across South Australia, which isn't good for local communities.
All right, Glenn Doherty, Mayor of Playford, thank you.
Well, you've been watching Newsday. Stay with us, because coming up, move over Carrie Bradshaw, because the well-heeled here in Asia are getting a much bigger chunk of the high-heeled market. Manolo Blahnik's expanding into the region, but we find out why the legendary footwear company won't be opening stores in China.
And before we go, just time to show you this runaway train. Passengers on a train in eastern India had a pretty narrow escape after 22 carriages detached and started rolling backwards. The carriages were carrying more than 1,000 people as they sped backwards for more than 7 miles. Luckily, though, they were brought to a stop by wooden wedges which were placed on the tracks, and nobody was hurt, although the authorities are trying to find out exactly what happened. That's all from us for the moment. Do stay with BBC World News.
Hello again, good morning. West Wales, the far southwest